Hello everyone, this is Mrs. Brown. The purpose of this presentation is to understand some of the key concepts and definitions that will go along with our units about understanding prejudice. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the concept of stereotypes, at the concept of prejudice, and at the concept of discrimination, and how these terms are related but distinct. The first thing that we're going to tackle is the idea of a stereotype. Now, a stereotype is actually a neutral. It's a pattern that is assigned to specific groups. They're not necessarily negative or incorrect. For example, basketball players tend to be tall. Soccer moms tend to drive minivans. Teenagers tend to play video games. A stereotype is simply a pattern that's been noted to be associated with a certain group. The issue is when the pattern becomes expected behavior. Gee, just because you're tall must mean that you're good at basketball, or just because you're driving a minivan must mean that you've got kids who play soccer, or just because you're a teenager means you're going to love video games. So the stereotype by itself is just a recognized pattern, and the issue becomes when you start to expect that every single person you meet is going to conform to that particular pattern. The next term is the idea of prejudice, which literally breaks down into prejudging someone. This means having an opinion of something before you have any facts and evidence. And again, this often will grow from the stereotypes. Now, prejudices are thoughts or feelings. They're things that you hold internally. And they do not always lead to an action. You may have a certain feeling, but you may behave in a certain way. So maybe you see somebody wearing a shirt from a company and you don't like that company. And you think, oh, well, I really don't like that company. That person's probably kind of snobby because they're wearing clothing with this expensive label, but you're still as polite and nice to them as you would be to someone else. So the prejudice is your feeling that you're holding, but you don't treat them any differently than you might treat someone else. And finally, we get into discrimination. Now, discrimination is an actual action or observable behavior. This means that you go so far as to treat people differently based on your prejudices. Now, sometimes discrimination is something that you know for a fact that you're doing, and sometimes it's unconscious. These feelings that you have based on the stereotypes and prejudice lead to inactions that you might not even be aware of. Now, discrimination can be made on the basis of race, on the basis of gender, someone's religion, sexual orientation, their appearance, their age, or even other factors can play into discrimination issues. Racism is a subset of discrimination. It's often used as synonyms, but it's actually a distinct part. There's other types of discrimination. Racism is specifically discrimination that's practiced against people because of their perceived race. Now, race is sometimes a social construct. We look at someone and say we think we can tell what race they're from. Different people are going to identify in different ways. And usually this is a majority versus a minority type of issue, where the people in the majority practice discrimination against people in the minority. Now, in the United States, we actually do have some laws that exist for protection against racism. For example, your race is not supposed to be considered when you apply for housing, when you apply for a job, and other things like that, where if you can prove that racism was a factor in the decision process, you actually have a legal recourse. Another type of discrimination that often plays a part, particularly in the literature and things that you're going to be studying throughout high school, is the idea of anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Semitism is very specifically a prejudice, hatred, or discrimination against someone who is Jewish. And you're discriminating against them for something connected to their Jewish religion or to their heritage. The most extreme example of this was what we saw during the Holocaust. And the roots to this actually go quite far back. If you go back into very early biblical times in the Old Testament, where Jews were very much set apart. They had a monotheistic religion that was very different from the tribes they were in. And then later on in the New Testament, they became separated from Christianity, where Jesus comes out of the Jewish community, but the Jewish community does not necessarily accept him as their Messiah that they are expecting. So you have this split that happens in this same basic faith. And then there have been, throughout history, just some really amazingly awful organized programs of discrimination against Jews. And this begins back with, we can go back to the Crusade days with the pogroms. You can look at their expulsion, where they're actually kicked out and said, if you're Jewish, you're not allowed to be here in England, and that was around 1290. There was a huge massacre of Spanish Jews. You can read through the list on the other side, obviously leading up to things like the Holocaust through Europe under the Nazis, and even some of the official Soviet policies after the Cold War that were very anti-Jewish. Jewish, and then the Jewish exodus from Arab and Muslim communities and countries where you still see this conflict in the world today. So what are the results of stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination? Part of it is this creation of the other. That is that sense that here's me and mine and the people I know in my group, in my community, my tribe. This is us. And then out there, there's a them. There's someone else who's different, separate, discrete from us. And humans are wired to see outsiders as dangerous and different, that someone who's different might be dangerous to us. And this perception creates barriers and makes it easy for us to create villains out of people who are different from us and to discriminate against them. Another concept and term that's often used in connection with these ideas is the idea of scapegoating. To scapegoating means to blame someone else for your problems, to find an excuse or a reason. And in a lot of people, this other that they've created from these minorities become responsible in your own mind, not in real life, for all of the problems in your life. If you can't get a job, it's because somebody else is taking your job. It's them. They're taking all of my jobs. If the schools are overcrowded, it's because they're crowding into our schools. Crime in the community is being committed by these other groups. So when you see these problems and issues, people have a tendency to, it's easier to believe that it's somebody else that's causing all of those than it is to recognize the flaws that you may have in your own character, in your own system, in your own community. And finally, we get to the idea of euphemisms and slurs. And this is when the very language that we use makes it easier for us to demonstrate our prejudice and to discriminate against others. If we can call somebody by a different name, it makes it easier to see them as other rather than as an individual. They become not real to us in some way. Naming and labeling things can create very strong impressions and attitudes. And then that euphemism lets us kind of settle back in and be comfortable with our bad attitudes because we have these other names for stuff. We saw this a lot during the Holocaust, where Hitler and the Nazis used completely different terminology that made it much easier for ordinary people to do the kind of atrocities that they did. For example, they're not burying bodies, they're burying schmatas, which was the word for rags. So just get rid of these rags. The propaganda referred to the Jews as an infestation, like they made people think of them as like bugs and stuff that was getting in the way, and made it easier to think about some way to remove them. And during the Holocaust in the concentration camps, they weren't murdering people, they were processing units. People were literally given a tattoo on their arm and they were recorded, and then, I didn't kill people today, I processed a certain number of units. And these kind of euphemisms and slurs that we use against the others, the people that we discriminate against, makes it easier for us to justify and to feel more emotionally okay with what we're doing. So how do we solve these issues? I mean, I wish I had an easy answer for you. This would be, solve some of the world's biggest problems. But some of the things that really do help are one-on-one connections. When you get to know someone as a person, you get to see beyond those stereotypical things that you have in your mind. And you'd say, hey, that's not this other person, that's my friend, and I know all about them, and I know that they're like this, and they like pizza with anchovies on it. And, you have this connection with someone on a personal level, and it's easier than trying to just see them as a particular group. When you have some empathy and compassion, when you can imagine what it must be like to be in the other person, to walk in their shoes, when you can recognize your own prejudices and your own stereotypes so that you can act on them. And finally, when we start to celebrate that people who are different from us is actually a good thing, that it adds to us rather than taking things away. And if you can celebrate the diversities, the differences in the culture, then you can get rid of some of the negative perceptions and the scapegoating that sometimes happens. And you'll see a lot of this in the literature that we will study throughout your high school career, actually. And so that's the end. I hope you have a better understanding of the differences between a stereotype, a prejudice, and a discrimination. See you next time.